The Memphis night was thick with the kind of heat that makes you feel like you're drowning in a swamp. The air was heavy, and the only sounds were the distant wail of a siren and the occasional thump of a car door slamming shut. It was a night when most people would rather be inside, but not Elvis Presley. He was out, and he was on a mission. Elvis was just a teenager then, but he already had a certain presence about him. He wore his hair in a slicked-back style, and his clothes were a mix of flashy and casual. He had a guitar slung over his shoulder, and he was wandering the streets of Memphis with a few of his friends. They were looking for trouble, or maybe just a good time. Either way, they didn't expect to run into the cops. It was around midnight when they stumbled upon a small, run-down church in the middle of a deserted street. The church was one of those old buildings that had seen better days, with peeling paint and a missing sign. The doors were open, and inside, a group of people were singing hymns. The sound of their voices drifted out into the night, and it was almost hypnotic. Elvis and his friends found a spot on the windowsill and started playing their guitars. They weren't trying to be loud, but they weren't exactly trying to be quiet either. They were just having fun, strumming and singing, and the music mixed with the hymns in a strange, almost beautiful way. But the people inside the church didn't see it that way. They were annoyed, and they called the police. It didn't take long for the sirens to start wailing, and before Elvis knew it, a squad car pulled up right in front of the church. Out of the car stepped two cops, one of them a tall, stern-looking man with a thick mustache, and the other a younger, more relaxed officer. They approached Elvis and his friends with a mix of curiosity and frustration. "Hey, you kids, what are you doing out here?" the older cop demanded, his voice gruff and no nonsense. Elvis, who was usually the quiet one, looked up and met the cop's gaze. He had a way of making people feel at ease, even in the most tense situations. "We're just playing some music, officer," he said, trying to sound innocent. The younger cop, who introduced himself as Tom, stepped in. "You're disturbing the service, kid. You need to scram." Elvis and his friends reluctantly put down their guitars and started to walk away. But as they turned to leave, Elvis turned back and looked the older cop in the eye. "You know, officer, one of these days, I'm going to be famous. I'm going to buy you for what you're worth and sell you for what you think you're worth." The cops exchanged a look, not sure whether to be amused or offended. But they let Elvis go, and he and his friends disappeared into the night. That night was just the beginning of Elvis's relationship with the Memphis police. Over the years, he would become friends with many of the officers, riding along on patrol, hanging out at the station, and even becoming an honorary officer himself. But that first encounter, in the middle of a hot Memphis night, was the start of something that neither Elvis nor the cops could have predicted. The night was still young, and Elvis had a lot of music to make and a lot of stories to tell. But for now, he and his friends were just a bunch of kids on the streets of Memphis, trying to find their place in the world. And the cops, well, they were just doing their job one night at a time. Elvis and Sonny were the best of friends. After school, Elvis would head down to see Mrs. Crunk, Sonny's grandmother, who lived in the Lauderdale courts. There was a big swing on her front porch, and Elvis would sit there with his Sears and Roebuck guitar, while Sonny showed him some chords. After a few minutes of guitar lessons, Elvis, Sonny, and their friend would head over to McDavitt Street to play touch football. It was just a regular group of neighborhood kids, hanging out and having fun. Sonny's grandmother later moved to McDavitt Street, and Elvis's family moved to a house on Saffirons right off McDavitt. They would all hang out at Porky's Drive-In and Thompson's Cafe, which was next to the old Roxy Theater. It was a scene like the TV show Happy Days, with everyone being buddies and having a good time. One day, Sonny showed Elvis how to play a few chords on his guitar. Later, Sonny learned a couple more chords, and Elvis picked up a few more too. They would often play their guitars together, and Red West would try to learn to play the trumpet. One night, they were all in Sonny's bedroom, making a lot of noise. Sonny's grandmother, who was crippled, had to come in a few times to tell them to quiet down. They tried to mute the horn, but it was still pretty noisy. Elvis was a regular kid at Humes High School. He and his friends, like Patrolman Robert Hare, would play football after school. Elvis would come over to the waterworks to play, and they all wore crew cuts, except Elvis, who had his hair styled in ducktails with long sideburns. They thought it was funny but never made fun of him. Elvis was always nice and friendly. He admired athletes and was friends with Patrolman Hare because he knew Hare played multiple sports at Humes. One time, Elvis was walking home from school while the football team was practicing. The ball went in his direction, and somehow his guitar got destroyed. The coach wasn't happy, and the next day, the players had to chip in some money to replace Elvis's guitar. If they had known how famous Elvis would become, they probably would have been more careful. Elvis also worked as an usher at the Lowe's State Theater. His friend, Patrolman Robert Clenny, hired him for the job. They all wore their hair in ducktails, and Elvis often wore a leather jacket with the collar turned up. They were just regular guys, and no one thought Elvis would become a superstar. Elvis's talent for singing was first noticed at a talent show at Humes. Patrolman Fred Frederick helped Elvis by getting a group of kids to cheer him on. Elvis performed "How Many Arms Have Held You" and won the show. Even though another student, Morris Biggs, did a great Al Jolson number, Elvis still won hands down. They still talk about that show and laugh about it. Elvis was also part of the school band and went on a trip to Ole Miss with them. Sergeant Gene Bradbury remembers Elvis singing a cappella on the bus ride back to Memphis. He had a great voice even back then. Elvis's car often broke down, and the firemen at the station had to push it out of the way so they could get the fire truck out. Patrolman Ronnie Trout remembers Elvis giving him a ride to St. Joseph's Hospital after school to help with his paper route. The old policeman in the parking lot would let Elvis park there, but he had to be back in 10 minutes. It was a fun and lighthearted routine. Elvis also played music with a band called Eddie Bond and the Stompers. They played at a radio station in West Memphis, and Elvis got his first airtime on the show. Later, he sang with the band at the High Hat Club, but the owner thought he wasn't good enough and looked a bit dirty, so Elvis was fired from the band. Elvis worked for Crown Electric Company, and one day he ran a stop sign. Patrolman V, L. Lane, pulled him over, and that's how he first met Elvis. They became good friends over the years, and Elvis was just a regular guy who had a lot of talent and a lot of heart. The day was quiet, and I was patrolling the streets when I spotted a truck that looked familiar. It belonged to my old school friend, Raymond Tipler. We stopped the truck, and the young driver handed us his license. The name on it read Elvis Presley. I gave him a courtesy ticket and told him I'd talk to Raymond about it. Later, I visited Crown Electric Company and found Raymond. I explained the situation and suggested Elvis should be a bit more careful on the road. Raymond agreed and called Elvis over. I chatted with Elvis, warning him again about his driving. He was polite and thanked me. A month later, I was at the police headquarters, getting ready for my shift. An officer told me someone was waiting to talk to me. It was Elvis. He had a friendly chat with me before I had to go to roll call. Elvis soon made his first record, and I happened to be at Sam Phillips' studio one day. Sam and I talked about Elvis, and I told him I thought Elvis was a good kid. Sam was excited about promoting him. Local radio personality Fred Cook recalled a time when a woman from rec radio, Miriam Kasker, brought Elvis' first record to him. She was enthusiastic, but Fred didn't like it much. He handed the record back, thinking Elvis wouldn't amount to much. Patrolman Bob Ferguson remembered the first time he heard "That's All Right, Mama" on the radio. He and his friends were driving around South Memphis, and they couldn't believe the singer was from their hometown. They were used to listening to black artists, and Elvis sounded just like them. Officer Jim Music kept in touch with Elvis while he was driving a truck. One night, Dewey Phillips played "That's All Right, Mama" over and over on the radio, and it stuck with Jim the whole way to work. Dewey was convinced it would be a hit. Officer Claire Lester was at the Greyhound racetrack when Elvis' record, "Blue Moon of Kentucky," played over the loudspeakers. The song moved everyone, and she felt chills down her spine. It was a powerful moment. Officer Dave Smith was driving home from a night shift when he heard Elvis music on the radio. At first, he thought it was terrible, but over time he grew to love Elvis' voice. Patrolman Robert Hare remembered a time when Elvis walked into a cafe, and his record was playing on the jukebox. The owners criticized the song, and Elvis left quickly, upset. Barbara Johnson, who worked at a bank, recalled when Elvis' father, Vernon, came in to pay off a loan for Elvis' guitar. Elvis came in the next day and asked her to help fill out a check for $500 to pay off the loan. The bank wouldn't extend more credit to Elvis, so he switched to another bank. Sheriff's Deputy J.W. Horton often went to a place called the Eagle's Nest, where Elvis would play. He attracted large crowds, and even when some guys tried to pick a fight with him, Elvis remained a gentleman. Fireman Sonny Byram saw Elvis' growth as a performer. He was getting more fans and could handle the crowds better. Elvis invited Sonny to play with him, but Sonny felt he wasn't good enough. Private Detective Kenneth Herman remembered a day when Elvis, Reggie Young, and Ronnie Smith walked into a Woolworth store. Elvis bought a $1 ring and gave it to a salesgirl, making her day. Officer Ed Buffalo became friends with Elvis after showing him his police motorcycle. They rode together, and Elvis even let Ed take his new Harley for a spin. Unfortunately, Ed rode it too fast and the chrome turned blue. Elvis just laughed it off. Patrolman V, L. Lane got a call to visit Elvis, who wanted to show off his new motorcycle. They had a Coke together, and Elvis was charming, even when women started to bother them. Fireman Sonny Byram saw Elvis' first brand new car, a pink and white 1955 Ford Crown Victoria. Elvis was proud of it and showed it to all his friends. Patrolman Jim Sinclair responded to a minor accident where Elvis was involved. Despite not being at fault, Elvis offered to pay for the damages. Jim's partner, who went to school with Elvis, chatted with him about old times. Elvis was just starting to become famous, but everyone could see the potential in him. He was a good kid, a hard worker, and a natural performer. The city of Memphis was about to see something special. Patrolman Charles Gregory often reminisced about his early days on the police force, patrolling Summer Avenue from Highland Street to the city limits. One of his most vivid memories was of Dewey Phillips, a local radio DJ who lived at 1043 North Perkins, just north of Summer Avenue. Dewey had a popular show called Red, Hot and Blue, and he would always advertise it with a catchy line, "Red, hot and blue. Get a wheelbarrow load of peanuts and run him through the front door and tell him Phillips sent Cha." Every night around 2 in the morning, Dewey would be driven home by none other than Elvis Presley. Dewey didn't have a driver's license because he had been arrested multiple times for driving while intoxicated. Charles and his partner would spend about 20 to 30 minutes chatting with Elvis. The young star loved talking about policing, asking what they had done that night, if they had written any tickets, and what was happening in the city. Elvis was very likable, personable, and respectful, and the patrolmen always enjoyed their conversations with him. Patrolman Bob Ferguson also had a story to tell about Dewey Phillips. Dewey was known to have a drug addiction and had been arrested several times. Bob had to arrest Dewey for a DWI in the early 1960s, when Dewey crashed into a telephone pole in East Memphis. Despite Dewey's inebriated state, the breathalyzer test didn't show high alcohol levels, suggesting he might have been under the influence of something else. Bob found it hard to arrest Dewey, as he had fond memories of visiting Dewey at the Kiska Hotel, where Dewey broadcast his show. As a teenager, Bob and his friends would bring records for Dewey to play. Sometimes Dewey would play them, and sometimes he would say, "No, I've heard that and it ain't no good." Even when Dewey was in a sour mood, Bob and his friends still thought he was the best DJ in the world. Patrolman Harold Dye recalled one of the most interesting events he worked: Elvis Presley's first big show in Memphis at Russwood Park. The park, located across Madison Avenue from Baptist Hospital, was expected to host around 8,000 to 8,500 people. Harold and 9 other police officers, along with 10 shore patrolmen from Millington Naval Base, handled security. The first person to arrive was a gray-haired lady who had bought her ticket, and was the first to enter the field when the gates opened. Keeping fans off the stage was a challenge, and after the show, they had to sneak Elvis out through the back gate and put him in a squad car to drive him away. Even then, it was difficult to get the crowd to leave the ballpark, because Elvis had left without saying goodbye. Patrolman Claude Hawkins remembered the blind game at Crump Stadium in 1955, a football game to benefit the Mid-South Lion Club site service. Elvis was there, but couldn't perform during the halftime show because he had signed with RCA Records. He crowned the football queen, and that was his only participation. However, a stampede occurred when the younger fans tried to mob Elvis. It was a chaotic and scary moment, and Elvis was visibly upset and nervous. Claude helped ensure Elvis's safe departure, and Elvis later mentioned that it was one of the few times he had felt true fear. Police traffic violations officer Barbara Johnston had a fond memory from her high school days. In 1955, she was chosen as the popularity queen at Humes High, and Elvis, who had graduated 2 years earlier, came back for a school carnival to crown her. Standing on stage, Barbara was nervous, but Elvis placed a glittery cardboard crown on her head. He then called her back to the stage and handed her an envelope with a cashier's check for $17, which was a lot of money back then. Patrolman Ross Hoopt remembered the incident at Crump Stadium, when Elvis was standing behind a group of girls. When Ross turned to look at him, he hollered for Elvis to leave. The girls were so excited that they started to pull apart the metal table in front of Ross like it was an accordion. The police had to call for backup and block off the street to get Elvis out safely. They put him in a squad car, and R.C. Hooker had to drive Elvis's car home for him. Officer the 5th, L. Lane, had a unique experience with Elvis. Lane met Elvis a few times at police headquarters during roll call. One day, Lane was driving to his relief point when a long, sleek Cadillac pulled up next to him. The driver, Elvis, hollered, "Hi, Lane." Lane pulled over, and Elvis introduced him to his mother, Gladys. They talked for a bit, and Lane told Elvis he needed to let the other officers go home. Elvis followed Lane to the changing point, and they all talked for a while. The officers were thrilled to meet Elvis and his mother. Patrolman Jimmy Willis had a memorable night riding with his partner, Rick Wilson, on the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. They noticed a new pink Cadillac with a guy with long hair driving it. Before they could pull him over, the driver stopped and got out of the car. It was Elvis Presley. They talked for a while, and then decided to race their Ford police car against Elvis's Cadillac on Madison Avenue. The Ford won, and they all laughed about it. Patrolman Arch Arkin had a story about a late-night encounter with Elvis. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, he and his partner, Raymond Stokes, stopped at Chenault's restaurant on South Bellevue. As they were leaving, a big Cadillac pulled up. The driver, a young man with a female passenger, yelled to Raymond. Raymond knew the driver and went inside to have a steak dinner. Arch stayed in the car to listen to the radio. Later, Raymond told Arch that the driver was Elvis Presley. Arch went inside, introduced himself, and talked with Elvis for a while. Patrolman Dave Smith remembered an incident late one evening when he was directing traffic at the intersection of Kerr Avenue and Bellevue Boulevard. A man on a motorcycle zoomed past him, shouting, "Get your big ass out of the road." Dave challenged him to come back and do better. The rider, Elvis, turned around, parked his motorcycle, and took Dave's place directing traffic. Elvis did a better job, and Dave was impressed. Patrolman Jimmy Willis had another story about Elvis's late-night visits to Chenault's restaurant. Elvis would often go there around 2 or 3 in the morning, parking his car around back and going inside with his friends. When Jimmy and his partner, Jerry Melton, would stop by, Elvis would always insist they order something. Elvis would pay for the whole party, and they would talk about the calls they had made during the night. Elvis enjoyed the company of the police officers and always treated them as friends. Patrolman Pat Adams and his partner once had to deliver warrants to Elvis Presley. They found out he had an unpaid speeding ticket and went to his house at 1414 Getwell. Elvis's father, Vernon, was trying to start a lawnmower in the backyard. They waited and helped Vernon start the mower. When Elvis arrived, they explained the situation, and he agreed to go to the station to pay the ticket. Elvis was polite and courteous, and even shared stories about his time on the stage show in New York. At the station, Elvis signed a check and paid the bond. Pat was surprised to see Elvis smoking long, slender cigars, but overall, it was a memorable and pleasant encounter. Officer the 5th, L. Lane, remembered the night he saw Elvis Presley directing traffic in front of 1414 Getwell. It was dark, and Elvis was using a tiny flashlight, which barely lit up the street. VL was worried that Elvis might get hurt, so he parked his car, walked over, and told Elvis to get off the street. VL said, "I'll take over until an officer can get here. "You're going to get hurt out here, fellow." Elvis stepped back, and V.L. directed traffic until a squad car arrived. Elvis then invited V.L. to come inside and meet his mom. V.L. walked into the house, and Mrs. Presley greeted him warmly. They chatted for a bit, and then V.L. left. A few months later, Elvis bought a new house at 1034 Audubon Drive. Patrolman Claude Hawkins recalled a time when he and his partner were parked on Madison Avenue, finishing an accident investigation. 4 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, and one of the riders was Elvis. He came over and spoke to Claude, remembering him from a previous encounter at Crump Stadium. Claude was surprised that Elvis remembered him, but they had a long conversation afterward. Patrolman Arch Arkin's dad managed the Warner Theater in downtown Memphis. As Elvis became more famous, it got harder for him to go out without causing a commotion. So Elvis started calling Arch's dad to ask if he could enter the theater through the stage door and sit in the balcony, where no one would bother him. Arch's dad said it was okay, and Elvis would come with his friends to watch movies in peace. Arch's mom once made a birthday cake for Elvis, and they celebrated together in the kitchen. They shared the same birthday, January 8th. Patrolman Fred Frederick had a funny story about Elvis at the Malco Theater. They went to see a movie starring Jane Russell, who was known for her curvy figure. Elvis couldn't help but comment on the movie, and a lady sitting in front of them turned around and told him to be quiet. When she realized it was Elvis, she fainted. The house lights came on, and they had to leave quickly. The next time Elvis wanted to see a movie, he rented the whole theater so he could talk as much as he wanted. Patrolman Flip Palmer remembered a time when Elvis and his entourage were leaving the Memphian Theater late at night. As they walked to Elvis's limo, they found a big funeral wreath on the hood. It was made of magnolia leaves and white flowers. Elvis was disturbed, but simply removed the wreath and threw it away. Then he drove off with his friends to the fairgrounds, which he had rented for the rest of the night. Patrolman Robert Hare talked about Elvis's office in the Starrick building. The office door had Elvis Presley Enterprises in big pink letters, which made it stand out among the other professional offices. The room was filled with letters, many of which Elvis hadn't even opened. The officers read some of the letters from fans, and they were quite something. Officer Jim McCullough's brother, Lloyd, played in a band and met Elvis at the Goodwin Institute, where different bands performed on Saturday nights. One time when Elvis was playing a big show in Shreveport, he invited Lloyd to sing a song on stage. Elvis was that kind of guy, always willing to help others. Captain Bill Moxley remembered a time when Elvis gave a pep talk to a group of young drivers. Everyone was focused on Elvis, and he made an excellent speech. Bill also mentioned that Elvis donated $5,000 each year to different organizations, including the Downtown Lions Club and the A. Crump Lions football game. This was a huge amount of money back then. Patrolman E.W. Hudgens was working downtown when he got a call to go to Lansky's men's store, because Elvis was shopping there. The fans were causing a commotion, so the officers had to keep them away. After shopping, Elvis was very polite and gave each officer a necktie and $100. Later, at a charity event at Russwood Park, Elvis joined a group of officers for a photo. At the time, Hudgens didn't think Elvis would become so famous. Police dispatcher Fred Woodward, Jr. shared a story about his father, Inspector Fred Woodward, S.R., who received a special watch from Elvis. It was a Lord Elgin with a unique rotating dial. Fred sold the watch to a museum years later, but it was a cherished gift from Elvis. Patrolman Flip Palmer also recalled the night of Danny Thomas's Shower of Stars concert at Russwood Park. Elvis came to the event, but wasn't allowed to sing. He made a speech and then came backstage, where he met Flip's wife and kissed her on the cheek. Flip was then asked to take Jane Russell back to her hotel, which made him and his partner a bit jealous. Patrolman Jim McCullough worked the night shift and often patrolled near the Jungle Garden, a popular drive-in restaurant. Elvis and his friends would sometimes stop by, and Elvis would come over to chat with the officers. He loved cheeseburgers and always showed respect to the police. Officer Jim Sinclair noted that Elvis enjoyed being around police officers. He would often show up at events where the police were present, and they accepted him as one of their own. Elvis even became a reserve police captain. Patrolman Joe Dunn first heard about Elvis Presley in 1956 when a friend mentioned him. They were walking around South Memphis when a pink Cadillac pulled up. The driver, who knew Joe's friend, offered them a ride. Joe was curious and later found out that the driver was Elvis. A few weeks later, Joe saw Elvis on the Tommy Dorsey Show, singing Blue Suede Shoes. He was amazed and realized that the guy who offered them a ride was the same person he saw on TV. Officer Claire Lester and her husband, Wallace, owned a house that they rented to Dixie Locke's family. One day they saw a long car parked outside and guessed it was Elvis's. Inside they found Elvis and his friend Nick Adams visiting Dixie. They all had a friendly conversation, and Claire was impressed by how polite and mannerly both Elvis and Nick were. The night of the show, Patrolman Pat Adams was on duty. He saw Elvis backstage before he went on, and the young star was a bundle of nerves. Elvis was about to perform after Georgie Jessel, who was a big name back then. Jessel was a flashy guy, always dressed to the nines with his gold and diamond rings, and he was sipping scotch from a flask. Jessel was telling everyone about his connections, like how he knew the Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. But even with all his fame, Jessel got hungry and asked an officer to get him a hamburger. He gave the officer $10, a fortune in those days, and only took a couple of bites before going on stage. When it was Elvis' turn, the place was packed. The crowd was electric, and Elvis was visibly nervous. But the moment the music started, he transformed. He forgot all about his nerves, and just let the music take over. The crowd went wild, and Elvis was the same charismatic performer that everyone knew and loved. Another time, Captain Barney Hitt and his partner were driving Elvis to a benefit show at Ellis Auditorium. Elvis was so nervous that he drank 3 or 4 Coca-Colas in quick succession. The auditorium was just a few blocks from Elvis' apartment, and it was a big deal in Memphis. But despite the nerves, Elvis always managed to put on a fantastic show. Patrolman George Jordan remembered the day Elvis moved to a house near Audubon Park. The fans were relentless. They would pull up grass from his yard just to have a piece of it. One day, Jordan and his partner, Joe Bishop, spotted Elvis driving his Cadillac on Park Avenue. They decided to pull him over, not because he did anything wrong, but just to meet him. Elvis was so polite and humble. He sat on the fender of their police car, and they chatted for about 15 minutes. Elvis even invited them to his house later, and they became good friends, but the fame took its toll. Patrolman Philip Robinett recalled how the crowd around Elvis' house on Audubon Drive was often so thick that it caused traffic chaos. Cars would circle the neighborhood just to get a glimpse of Elvis. The fans would take anything they could get their hands on, even if it meant ruining his yard. The neighbors were fed up, and they even offered to buy Elvis' house just to get some peace. It was a tough situation, and the police had to help Elvis get in and out of his house sometimes. One evening, Patrolman Don Rogers was on duty when he got a call about a disturbance at a Gulf service station. When he arrived, he found Elvis at the center of a heated argument. Elvis had pulled into the station with a broken air conditioner, and the attendants were angry because his car was blocking the pumps. They tried to force him to move, and a fight broke out. Elvis ended up hitting one of the attendants, and both were taken to the police station. Despite the incident, Elvis was always polite and even signed an autograph for Rogers, using a traffic ticket as the paper. The next day, Elvis had to appear in court. The building was swarming with people, and the hallway was so crowded that it was hard to move. Elvis was nervous, but he made friends with the police, and they reassured him. The charges against him were eventually dismissed, but the incident left him worried about the publicity. Later that day, Patrolman Pat Adams and his partner visited Elvis at his house, and they found him pacing the floor, worried about the attention. They tried to calm him down, and Elvis showed them a telegram offering him a boxing match for $5,000. It was a surreal moment, and Adams and his partner reassured Elvis that everything would be fine. Elvis' fame also led to some bizarre incidents. One time, a truck pulled up to his house, and some guys unloaded a custom-made sports car. Elvis was like a kid with a new toy, and the crowd was so thick that it took ages to get the car on the street. Another time, Elvis was confronted by 3 people, and he pulled out a pistol to scare them off. It turned out to be a toy, but it was enough to cause a stir. From then on, The police asked Elvis to report his movements to avoid any more altercations. Despite all the chaos, Elvis always remained friendly and humble. He was a star, but he never forgot his roots. The police who knew him best remembered him as a good guy, even if his fame sometimes made things complicated. Patrolman Ed Buffalo often found himself directing traffic for Elvis Presley when he lived on Audubon Drive. It was a casual affair, with Elvis coming out to chat and introduce his guests. Nick Adams, a star from the TV show The Rebel, was one of them. Nick really stood out to Ed because he was such a down-to-earth guy. Elvis was a great host, always friendly and welcoming. Patrolman Philip Robinet had a different story about Nick Adams. He said Nick stayed at Elvis' house for a while, but was often left with nothing to do or money to go anywhere. Sometimes, Philip and his partner would give Nick a ride in their squad car to a cafe and buy him a cup of coffee. It was a small gesture, but it showed how much Elvis and his friends cared for each other. Officer Ed Ross had a funny encounter with Elvis at Amro's music store. His partner Hal Winfield wanted to trade his banjo for a guitar, but Elvis just took the banjo and left. They kept trying to catch Elvis at home to get the banjo back, but he was never there. One night, Winfield climbed over the fence and rang the doorbell. Elvis' dad answered and handed over the banjo, which now had Elvis written all over it. Winfield wasn't too happy about it, but it was a memorable moment. Patrolman Ross Hooped knew Elvis well because his partner, Ken Heckle, was a distant relative. One night, Elvis rode up to their squad car on his motorcycle, with Natalie Wood as his passenger. They chatted for a while, and it was just another night in Memphis for Elvis. He often invited the officers to his house, and they never hesitated to accept. Patrolman Ed Buffalo was once helping school kids cross the street when Elvis Presley pulled up on his motorcycle with a pretty girl. They talked for about 20 minutes, and the girl's colorful language made quite an impression. Her name was Natalie Wood, and she was memorable in more ways than one. Memphis Fire Department. Chief J. Fuller recalled how Elvis always visited the fire station, even though he was often run out as a kid. He had a deep respect for firefighters and policemen. One time, Elvis and Natalie Wood came to the station on his motorcycle. It was right before Christmas, and the captain was making a shoeshine box for his son. Elvis asked Natalie to autograph the box, and she did. The studio found out about her motorcycle rides with Elvis and called her back to Hollywood. Patrolman Robert Hare had a unique relationship with Elvis. They met at the Rainbow Skating Rink, and Elvis and his friends would try to knock them down while skating. One time, Elvis knocked Robert across the floor, and Robert knocked Elvis over the rail. Surprisingly, Elvis laughed it off, and they became good friends. During breaks, Elvis would hand Robert his comb, and they'd go through the same routine every time. Robert wished he had kept that comb. Chief J. Fuller also shared that Elvis always wanted to play with the Memphis Fire Department band, but they wouldn't let him because you had to be a fireman. It was a dream Elvis never gave up on, even after he became famous. Patrolman Gene Bradbury was once on duty at McKellar Lake when Elvis showed up with his entourage. Elvis remembered Gene from high school and talked to him for almost an hour. It was a testament to Elvis' incredible memory and genuine interest in people. Patrolman R.B. Summers felt that Elvis became more aware of people after he became famous. They had a chance encounter when R.B. was driving a soda truck, and Elvis stopped to talk. Over the years, Elvis always showed a keen interest in R.B.'s life and work. R.B. believed that Elvis studied the Hume's High Yearbook to recognize people he went to school with, ensuring no one felt left out. Captain Barney Hitt and Dick Davis talked Elvis into doing a benefit for the widows of policemen. The fans were always wild about Elvis, and they'd try to get a piece of his clothing or hair. Despite the chaos, Elvis was always polite and respectful. Assistant Chief Jimmy Music handled security for Elvis locally for about 10 to 12 years. It all started with a New Year's Eve party, and they kept in touch, updating each other on their lives. Patrolman Robert Hare often went to the movies with Elvis and his friends. They'd see a good movie, but if Elvis didn't like it, he'd stop it and start another one. It was just one of the perks of being friends with a superstar. Patrolman V L. Lane remembered a morning when a fleet of cars, including Elvis' Cadillac, cruised down Bellevue. Elvis recognized him and introduced him to his friends. He even invited Lane to visit his new home, which he called his mansion. Graceland, located at 3764 Highway 51 South, was originally built in the 1930s. When Elvis bought it, it was being used by Graceland Christian Church. The purchase price was $100,000, and it became a famous landmark. Patrolman Dewey Phillips helped Elvis with fans one day when they were chasing him on his motorcycle. Elvis was heading to the Linden Theater, and the officers kept the fans at bay. After work, they all went to the theater, where Elvis had rented it for a big party. Phillips always found Elvis to be a nice guy, someone who could be himself around the police. The Linden Circle was a popular neighborhood movie house, and it was a favorite spot for Elvis and his friends. Captain Barney Hitt always enjoyed working with Elvis. He was a good boy, always polite, and he knew a lot of people in the police department. Elvis once said that if he couldn't be an entertainer, he would have liked to be a policeman. He loved joking and clowning around with the officers. Fireman Sonny Byram was invited to visit Elvis at Graceland. Elvis gave him a tour, and they had peanut butter and bologna sandwiches in the kitchen. Elvis talked about how he couldn't get out on the streets much, and wanted to give Sonny his phone number so he could visit again. It was a simple, heartfelt visit that showed just how much Elvis valued his friendships. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was more than just a music icon to those who knew him. Many of his close friends and acquaintances, like the police officers and firefighters of Memphis, saw him as a regular guy with a big heart and a love for fun. One day, a man and his wife, along with his aunt, drove to Graceland Elvis' home just to take a peek. To their surprise, they saw Elvis in his yard and called out to him. Without hesitation, Elvis invited them in, showing the kind of warm and friendly person he was. Lieutenant Pat Adams had been telling his wife for days that he knew Elvis, but she didn't believe him. Tired of the arguments, he finally took her to Graceland to prove it. As they pulled up, Elvis spotted them and walked over to the car. He greeted Pat, chatted with his wife, and even invited her to visit again. The encounter left Pat's wife amazed and a little embarrassed for doubting him. Patrolman Jimmy Hammers often saw Elvis stop to talk with police officers whenever they crossed paths. One time, Elvis even invited Hammers and others to play football in his yard on Sundays. This became a regular event, and they later moved the games to Graceland Elementary School. These moments showed how Elvis loved spending time with his friends, even if it meant playing a simple game of football. Fireman Jim Crow remembered visiting Graceland at night with a group of friends. They would hang out in the basement, watch TV, and play pool. Elvis would join them without any fuss, just like one of the guys. Crow noted that despite being a famous celebrity, Elvis treated everyone as equals, making everyone feel at ease. Elvis also enjoyed the thrill of amusement parks. Patrolman Jim McCullough and his brother Lloyd joined Elvis at the fairgrounds, where they rode the rides and had a blast. Elvis was especially fond of the Dodgem cars, where he would bump into other cars and have endless fun. When Elvis was about to join the Army, he expressed to Patrolman Robert Hare that he wished he could join the police department. Hare suggested that Elvis join the National Guard to avoid leaving home, but Elvis ultimately chose to serve his country, which many believed helped him in the long run. Elvis' time in the Army didn't change his close relationships with his friends. Patrolman Ed Buffalo once asked Elvis to help find a rare machine gun, which Elvis tried to do while overseas. Even though he didn't find it, the request showed how close they were. After Elvis returned from the Army, Parker and a couple of friends needed help getting out of town. Patrolman Harold Dye and his partner Bob Ferguson escorted them, and in return Parker gave them each a plush nipper dog, which had been used as a stage prop during Elvis performances. Dye cherished the memory, even though he wished he had taken better care of the dog. Officer Lynn Lovett, who spent a lot of time with Elvis, found it hard to relax around him. Despite knowing him for years, Lovett and others always felt a bit in awe. They wanted to please Elvis and make him happy, which sometimes made it difficult to be natural. Elvis, being aware of this, must have felt the strain of living in such a luxurious yet constrained environment. Patrolman Ross Hoopt and a few others were invited to watch movies with Elvis at the Memphian Theater around midnight. On one occasion, they drove to Graceland and found Elvis with his family, including his little dog he brought back from Germany. These moments, both big and small, painted a picture of Elvis as a man who cherished his friendships and enjoyed the simple pleasures of life. Elvis Presley's legacy isn't just about his music. It's about the genuine connections he made with the people around him. His kindness, generosity, and love for his friends will always be remembered,